everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening at our Histories Online series, held in conjunction with the National Library's exhibition Human Nature Environmental Histories of Singapore. This exhibition traces the history of Singapore's natural environment and how our present-day relationship with it is shaped by this legacy. The exhibition is now on until 26 September 2021 at the National Library building. This evening's topic is biodiversity and conservation in Singapore's fresh waters. Our speaker tonight is Darren Yeo, Deputy Head of Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. He is an Associate Professor at the Department of Biological Sciences, National University of Singapore, where he leads the Freshwater and Invasion Biology Laboratory. I will now pass the session on to Darren. Thank you.
Today, I'll be talking a little bit about biodiversity and conservation in Singapore's freshwaters in a few groups of organisms. Maybe before I start, just a very quick background. I'm trained in freshwater crustacean, freshwater crab, prawn taxonomy, which means I go and describe new species and classify them and things like that. But my lab also does a lot of work on freshwater ecology and diversity, as well as invasion biology. So that will come out in the talk because I'll be focusing a lot on these areas, crustaceans as well as alien fish, non-native fish species. Okay. So before I move further, I want to thank National Library Board for inviting me to give this talk. A lot of the things I'll be talking about in this talk based on partnerships and support from all these organizations, including my own home organizations, as well as government agencies and various other bodies. And very importantly, a lot of photographs and inputs in this talk are a lot of them are from books that I've been involved in the past, Private Lives, Natural Heritage of Singapore, and these are some of the people who have contributed either in photographs or in feedback and inputs. And I have to shout out to my lab because a lot of the work has been done by my lab, started about 10 years ago. Anything that is good here is all thanks to them. Anything that doesn't look so good is probably my fault for not presenting properly. Okay, so let's start off with the scope. So basically, I'm going to give a very quick intro to Singapore's freshwaters, then I'll talk about change. Since this theme is supposed to be about histories, right? So I'll talk about change in freshwaters and then how to deal with this change. So a little bit about Singapore's surprising freshwaters. Just a very brief overview. So Singapore, as you all know, is highly urbanized city-state. You can see from the picture here, it's really a lot of built-up areas. If you just look at a satellite photo, it's really mostly gray, some green areas, but from a satellite view, it's really very, very built up, very urbanized. But if you look more closely, right, Singapore has a lot of fresh water, right? 2/3 of Singapore's land area is water catchment, okay? So water catchment means all this ultimately water from the land will flow into streams, drains, longkangs, and all these ultimately will flow and be collected in reservoirs. So all these are important for our water needs. So the majority of Singapore's freshwater habitat, right, are urban freshwaters. Okay, they are in unprotected catchments. Unprotected meaning these areas, there's development, there's people can access these areas very easily and things like that. The conditions of these habitats are a little bit different from the other type of habitat. The other type of habitat are the natural freshwater habitats. These are fewer, they are more concentrated in certain areas of Singapore, and they are more protected. All right, so access is more limited, there's limited development in and around these areas. The conditions tend to be a little bit different from the urban freshwaters. So maybe I'll go a little bit more into detail. So these natural freshwaters, right, they include things like forest streams. Some of you will probably have gone out for nature hikes and all that in the Central Catchment Nature Reserve. Hopefully you don't go into the streams, but you walk past the streams, you can see things like this, right? So typically the forest streams will be like this. Very slow flowing, very shallow, sandy, very shaded, a lot of tree cover and things like that. Then there's one particular type of forest stream that is very rare in Singapore. Very few places have it, and these are the hill streams. So there are only in certain places you'll find it's basically like a forest stream, but it's more rocky and the water is a little bit less acidic. Oh yeah, forgot to add that the water in the forest streams tends to be acidic. All right, so it's acidic because there's usually leaf litter and from the falling leaves and all that, and so as it decomposes, you have these tannins or acids that will be going into the water. Another type of natural habitat is the Nee-Soon. It's a freshwater swamp. So our example is Nee-Soon Swamp Forest, which is the only one of its kind in Singapore, right? So it's obviously more swampy, the soils are more waterlogged, and it's even more acidic than the forest streams. Okay, so then what about urban habitats? Urban habitats really account everything. That includes drains, canals, and all that. So typically, you will have things like rural streams. In some of the older literature, they call it open country streams. So these are streams that are, they look like a normal stream, right? Except that it's grassy banks. Instead of trees and very shaded, it's very exposed, right? So slightly less acidic, less leaf litter, warmer, right? More exposed. Then you have your urban waterways, concrete canals and drains. Don't look down on these things. They're full of life. They still have a lot of diversity, right? Maybe not the same kind of diversity as you have in the forest, but still there's life in these things, right? So urban waterways, concrete canals and drains are quite important. Reservoirs are also counted as urban habitats or artificial modified habitats. You have your inland reservoirs and your coastal reservoirs. Even though they look really natural, right? Because a lot of them have, or some of the ones in the central part of Singapore, they have these forested margins and all that. Ultimately, it's still artificial, right? Because we don't have natural lakes and all that. Okay, then of course ponds, and so various types of ponds are quarries, landscape pond, golf course pond, garden pond, all the pond, okay? So all these are different types of artificial habitats. So what is inside these habitats, right? So what is the diversity that's inside these habitats? So let's start off by looking very briefly at the natural freshwater habitats. Okay, most of the species are native species. Okay, native meaning they originate here, they evolved here in this part of the world. Okay, and we have actually a very rich native biodiversity. This is just a very brief snapshot of several different groups. You have, I think you all can see my cursor, right? You have plants, spiders, you have insects, you have worms or leeches, which are related to the worms, you have mollusks, you have amphibians. These are tadpoles inside a tree hole with water, frogs, and you have your reptiles, okay? So the reason I put this here all in one slide is because I'm going to focus more on fishes and crustaceans. So I just put this here to appease those of you who want me to talk about other things. Sorry, I'm not going to talk about this because I can't. I don't know all this stuff. Okay, so anyway, so on the topic of freshwater biodiversity in Singapore, right? What's interesting is that there's a good natural heritage aspect to our freshwater diversity, right? There are several species, national natural heritage, okay? So there are several species that were actually described from Singapore. In other words, they were first discovered in Singapore. The scientists first wrote the papers, found the specimens here, and they named them after specimens that were found in Singapore, in streams in Singapore. So one example is this, the Harlequin Reservoir. So this is a quite popular fish in the aquarium trade. This one was described in the 19th century from a few different streams, some in Malaysia, some in Singapore. The stream in Singapore, I think, was formerly where the Botanic Gardens is now. So you can imagine the Botanic Gardens now has a small little forested area, right? I think it was a lot more extensive in the 19th century to have this kind of species, because this is typically found in forest streams, right? And the interesting thing is, even up to the 1980s, the 1990s, we were still discovering new species in Singapore. So these remaining three, right? This little catfish here and these two shrimp, right? All of them were described in the 1990s, right? So they're not very big, they're quite small. And the thing is, it just goes to show how little we know about our biodiversity. We're still discovering new species even up to the 1990s. The other thing about our aquatic biodiversity or freshwater biodiversity is it also includes a lot of things that are only found in Singapore and nowhere else in the world. These are endemics, right? So there are other types of endemics, but since I work on crabs, I'm a bit biased. I just show you the crabs. So there are three species of freshwater crabs that are found in Singapore and nowhere else in the world. Singapore freshwater crab, Johnson's freshwater crab, and swamp forest crab. Okay, so these three, that means if they go, let's say, something happens, the population crashes or whatever, there's no eggs in another basket. No, this is the basket, right? So once it's gone for good globally, right? So better take care of them. Okay, anyway. So you have your urban freshwater species as well, right? So I talked about I just give you a brief snapshot of the native biodiversity. What about the urban biodiversity? The urban biodiversity is mostly non-native species, okay? I'm not going to run through a snapshot of the non-native species. Rather, I'm actually going to tell stories about them. So this brings us to the next part of this talk, okay? So in going with the theme of this series that's talking about histories, right, I decided to talk about the biology and some of the work that my colleagues, my students, myself, we do in the context of change, right? How things have changed from the past to the present. Okay, so and the urban species the non-native species found in the urban habitats will feature very prominently in this section. Okay, I mean, Singapore has a long post-colonial history. From 19th century already, people were doing work and all that, but I will just bring it to something where at least some of our audience hopefully can relate to. That means from the 60s to the 70s and then further, right? So we start with the 60s, right? Changing habitats and changing fish diversity. So what I want to say here is that originally, right, a lot of our habitats were like the natural forest streams I was showing you just now, right? The natural forest streams, the freshwater swamp. Our typical freshwater habitats were like that: small, slow-flowing, shallow, acid water forest streams, no large rivers or lakes, right? So if you look at this map from the 1960s of Singapore, only three reservoirs, only 3 reservoirs. Now we got 17, right? So this is circa 1966. So from the mid-60s to now, right, we have actually built up to 17 reservoirs, right? So a lot has happened. So all the reservoirs that we might be familiar with now, Kranji, Sungai Seletar, Punggol, Serangoon, and in fact, Upper Seletar, Upper Pierce, and all these came in the last 40 years. Right? So there's been a lot of change in the history of our freshwaters. Because there were no large rivers or lakes in Singapore, right? There have never been any large rivers or lakes. It's safe to assume that we never had large river species. We never had species of fishes or other organisms that are usually found in large rivers or lakes. Okay, because we never had these in the first place, right? So as the habitats change, the diversity also changes, because now we start to have this kind of habitat, right? Because we have had extensive canalization or impoundment of the river drainages. So there have been 2 types of changes to our freshwater systems. One is they canalize the drainages, right? Canalize means they basically concretize, straighten, right? You want to make a canal, right? For good reason, right? To control floods, to control, mosquito breeding and things like that. But basically you go from something like this to something like this, right? So there's this change in habitat. Then the other change, of course, is when they dam up the drainages or dam up the river mouth, and you get a reservoir and all that, which is important, right? So there are all these changes, and because of these changes, there have been resulting changes in the fish diversity. Now, for a long time, people were just saying it now, so it's very anecdotal. We said, we now have lakes, so therefore we have big river fish that were not here last time, right? But what we wanted to do in my lab was we wanted to actually study it just to document it and quantify it, and just to be sure, right? So what we did was we studied changes in freshwater fish assemblages, groupings of freshwater fishes in these drainages following canalization or impoundment, right? So we have data stretching back to 1966 from that important paper where I showed you the map, right? As well as from the museum. And then we compared it with data that we collected in the 2000s up to 2010. So you can see the map of the 2 maps look quite different, right? So there's been a lot of changes. So we want to see what happens to the fish diversity in these places. So in a nutshell, you have loss of native species, loss of native species in both the canals as well as the reservoirs. So some of those that became canals, okay, some of the native species are gone. Some of those that became reservoirs, also some of the native species are gone, right? The other thing that happened was specifically the native bottom feeding fishes, right, were replaced by non-native species in the reservoirs. So in the canals, you might still have some of these bottom feeding fishes, but in the reservoirs, you definitely have a replacement of these native bottom feeding species by non-native species. The other thing that we found was that the food webs or food chain, big fish eat small fish and eat zooplankton, eat phytoplankton, eat plant, whatever, right? So we found that they are shorter in the canals and longer in the reservoirs compared to our old data, right? And this kind of makes sense because the canals are very harsh environments. There's very little nutrients in these canals. Although sometimes when you look at it and it's looking very sluggish and all that, it looks like there must be a lot of nutrients because it's full of algae and all that. But then every now and then when there's a storm, right, you have this huge wall of water coming, flash flood. Canals are built for flash floods, right? So that every now and then it's a very unstable habitat for an animal to live in, right? And nutrients get washed off all the time, every now and then. So it makes sense that the food chains there tend to be shorter. The reservoirs tend to be bigger, tend to be a bit more stable. They have a large catchment area where nutrients will come in, flow off the land into little streams and rivers and all that, and which in turn flow into the reservoir. So ultimately, the reservoirs accumulate a lot more nutrients, and this can support longer food chains, right? So, okay, enough of that. In pictures, these are basically some of the results of the study. These are examples of some of the native stream species that were present in the drainages before 1966, right? But that means in our data, they were recorded before 1966, but in the same places post 1966, by 2010, they were lost from all the canals and the reservoirs. This includes things like this catfish, this loach, this is a spiny eel, this is another catfish, and then some of these pretty typical midwater aquarium type fishes, right? The Harlequin reservoir, and this is a six-banded buck. So these are all very typically forest species. So they are forest specialists. They need good forest conditions, cool water, acid water, and all this kind of thing. So canals are too harsh for them. Reservoirs are too harsh for them also. Okay, you have non-native riverine species that were absent in the drainages before 66, but they are now present in our reservoirs by 2010. These are non-native species. These are big animals that can actually, if they were in our streams, they won't do well because the streams are really small. And these are very large animals, right? So, but now we have the habitat. We didn't have it before, now we do, right? So they are in our reservoirs also. We found that in the study. You also have non-native species that are typical of lake environments. We never had lakes, but now we have artificial lakes, which are reservoirs, right? So these are also found in our reservoirs by 2010. These are just some of the species, right? And we also have generalists, okay, what we call generalists. So they can be found in lakes, they can be found in rivers, and they are typically in very open habitats. When I say rivers, I mean they're found in larger rivers, not in the quiet forest streams and all this. So these are species that you also find in our reservoirs now, but they weren't in the drainages 40 years ago. All right, so that's 40 years ago. Let's move back maybe 20, 30 years ago. So post-1980s, that was post-1960s. Post-1980s, what changes, right? So from post-1980s, the interesting thing is there were more newcomers. Okay, more species were being brought in, or more species were being introduced, right? So now I just run through a few species that some of you might not have seen in Singapore freshwaters 20 to 30 years ago. I'm assuming, of course, all of you are, when your kids, you're running around in the longkangs and all that, or in the streams if you can find them. But if not, then never mind. But for those of you who might be familiar, these are some species that you might not have seen 20 to 30 years ago. Okay, how did they get into Singapore? There are various ways that they get in Singapore. Okay, they can come in through the pet trade, through the live food trade. But then once they are in the trade, doesn't mean they are in the environment straight away, right? They also have to be put into the environment. So there are various modes that they can be introduced into the wild. Sometimes they accidentally they escape from a farm, or people abandon pets, or people do religious release and things like that. So there are various ways that these things get into Singapore and then get into the environment. So one of these groups that is quite prominent post-1980s are the cichlids. We've had cichlids from the Second World War, okay, but that time was only one or two species. But from the 1980s, a lot more started to be brought in. Cichlids are a group of fishes. It's a family of fishes, including things like the tilapia, angelfish, discus, oscar, and all this, right? Peacock bass. And they are very popular aquarium fish, right? Very, very successful. In other parts of the world, they're very successful non-native invasive fish. The reason why they're so successful as non-native or invasive fishes is because they're very adaptable, very high tolerance. They have egg and brood care. It means they really take care of their young. That means they will defend their young. They won't just dump the eggs and then go off somewhere. They really take care of the young and all that. And this is how their populations succeed and persist, right? And it includes some of the, like as I said, some very popular aquarium species, but also some very popular food fish also, right? So right now in Singapore, we have up to about 30 over species of cichlids recorded. This is one of the examples of the cichlids. And sometimes the interesting thing is a new introduced species, a new non-native species will come in and displace an old non-native species, right? So here, what we have below is the tilapia, the Mozambique tilapia. Now, this is the fish that is supposed to have been brought into Singapore during the Second World War as a protein source during the Japanese occupation, right? So it established, and it was common in our freshwaters, post-World War II, right? But in the 1980s, this fish, which is another cichlid, so this one is African, the top one is from South Asia, right? This species called the green chromite started appearing. It was brought in 80s, 90s, around there, right? And interestingly, right, now, if you go out and see, or when we did our studies, you find find that they tend to start to replace the tilapia. In many places, the tilapia used to be. When I was a kid, I used to see the tilapia, even though it's a freshwater fish, you can see it off the jetty when you go to take the ferry to Ubin, or you go to Sungai Buloh Bridge in the early 90s, the Sungai Buloh Bridge, you look down, you see a lot of tilapia. Now, you go there, you go to the Changi Jetty, you go to Ubin, Changi Jetty, you go to Buloh, the bridge there, and you look down, you tend to see mostly this, right? So they have started to take over the niche that the Mozambique tilapia was occupying. But they're still around, these fellas are still around. They are in the canals. Okay, so if you walk along canals and all that, you see a lot of tiny little things flashing and all that. They are actually babies of these guys. So this is another example of a non-native possibly taking over another native. The giant snakehead is a Southeast Asian species. It's brought in from Malaysia or Thailand. Again, even though it's Southeast Asian, doesn't mean it's native to Singapore, because we never had the right habitat for this, right? So obviously it was brought in. Probably been in Singapore since the 70s. Around 90s, 80s, 90s, the peacock bass started to appear in our reservoirs, and anecdotally, we've spoken to some people who spend a lot of time at reservoirs. The peacock bass seems to be starting to push out the toman, right? The giant snakehead, right? They are both top predators. It's not as if one eats the other, but remember, they can eat each other's fry. They can eat each other's babies, right? So they can compete for food, but they can also prey on each other. Maybe not the big one fight with the big one, but they will go for the young of each other, right? Some other examples, these are just a few more examples. The African shark-tooth catfish. This came into Singapore in the 90s. It's a very large catfish. We have a native equivalent called the common walking catfish, the one below, right? And this one is common in our urban areas. But post-90s, post-95, you see that where it used to occur, now is mainly the African shark-tooth catfish. So it's displacing it. The African shark-tooth catfish grows 2 or 3 times bigger than our native common walking catfish. Ironically, our common walking catfish is regarded as a terrible invasive species in other parts of the world. So it's like, while it's busy attacking other parts of the world, home base kena attacked by some other invasive. How ironic. Okay. Another example, golden apple snail. This is the snail that was in the news lately. People were talking about the mentaiko. It produces those pink eggs. I didn't want to spend too long talking about them, therefore I didn't put a big picture of the pink eggs. But the South American apple snail has been replacing the Southeast Asian apple snail in Singapore's urban waters. So this is another example of something that came in the 80s, 90s and started replacing things that we have here. One species that came in the 80s that hasn't started replacing things yet is the red claw crayfish. Now this is very popular in the aquarium trade, and also I think people do sell it for food. Now less popular, but people still catch it at the prawn fishing ponds and all that. So it's established in our reservoirs. It was brought into Singapore probably around mid-80s, late 80s, thereabouts. This one, I've got nothing to say about, this crayfish is replacing our native crayfish, because we don't have native crayfish, right? So this species is a tropical species from northern Australia and New Guinea. We don't have native crayfish, but we have native freshwater crabs. Functionally, they are actually quite similar. They occupy very similar niches. Right, so that's the one that we are worried about. We are worried about this guy possibly displacing our native freshwater crabs. And through some experimental work, we have found that they can potentially outcompete our native freshwater crabs simply by the fact that they are much bigger and they grow much faster, right? So there was some work done in my lab some years ago. Some more newcomers, again, 80s and 90s. These are just 2 examples of amphibians that came in around this time. The American bullfrog, very popular for food, also sold sometimes as feeder for carnivorous fishes in aquarium trade. So this one probably was imported for food and aquarium trade and all that. The Gunter's frog is from China or East Asia. This one is probably an accidental import. They don't all, it's not all the things that come in are intentionally imported. This one was probably accidental, probably came in with plants. There are a few species that we suspect came in accidentally with, we call them hitchhikers. So this one possibly came in with plants. The interesting thing is this one is found in certain parts of Singapore wherever there's landscaping around water feature and all that, you can hear them. It's one of the few frogs that calls in the day. Are they a problem? We know very little. There are very little studies about the ecology of these animals. I had one student who did a small study on the American bullfrog and basically found that they don't do well. They are, a lot of people release them. release the American bullfrogs, they release them for religious release and all that, but they don't seem to do well. So maybe that's a good thing for our native species. So one more thing, post 1980s, I finished talking about the newcomers, right? So one more interesting change post 1980s with respect to freshwater biodiversity is this. We have these new reservoirs, right? We have this habitat, unoccupied, right? The reservoirs, when they were created, they are basically novel habitats. They are artificial. There's nothing inside. At first, it's just body of water, right? So what's going to happen is how does the community form, right? We found that the novel habitats, when I say novel habitats, I mean the reservoirs, right? The reservoirs actually form novel food webs. In other words, the food webs and the communities are basically unique combinations of non-native species, right? Why non-native species? Because the reservoir conditions are very different from our forest stream conditions. Our forest stream fishes are not going to swim out from the forest stream into the reservoir and say, wow, now I've got a very big area to play, and occupy the reservoir and form a food web, okay? Because the conditions are simply too different. So most of the time they will stay inside the forest. So what happens is people start releasing them. As I said just now, there are various ways that people release or accidental escapes, whatever. These fishes end up in the reservoirs, right? And as time goes on, they form their own food web with the organisms there. So each of these reservoirs has their own unique food web. Interestingly, they are comparable in terms of complexity to a natural lake, because we compared these against some of the natural lakes in Southeast Asia. And in terms of complexity, they are comparable, okay? Maybe not as rich as the natural lakes. So this was when we did a study of 6 reservoirs, 47 species in total. Again, most of it non-native species. There are some native species, not many. There are some very hardy native species that can be found in the urban environments. Doesn't mean zero, okay? There will always be some, but by and large, most of them are forest species. So what do all these changes mean? I've been talking about change, right? What does all this mean? 2 things, okay? In terms of freshwater biodiversity. One of the things is that there is a freshwater biodiversity squeeze, right? Because the habitats are changing, right? So as the habitats change, if you assume that the native species like the natural habitats, or they prefer natural habitats, they are not good at the artificial habitats. So as the habitats change, they start to squeeze more and more into whatever remaining natural habitats that's left. So there's a freshwater biodiversity squeeze. One classic example is with Nee Soon swamp forest I mentioned just now, right? So if you look at this map here, all the pink areas are where originally there were freshwater swamp forest habitat long time ago. Okay. Now the only part left is this small little patch here, okay, in the Central Catchment Nature Reserve. So that makes Nee Soon swamp forest very, very important, because a lot of things that need swamp forest conditions can only find it there in Singapore, nowhere else, right? So this freshwater biodiversity squeeze means that most of the native species in Singapore, again, not including the tougher ones which can handle canal conditions, can handle reservoir conditions, but most of the more sensitive ones, they are restricted to the CCNR, the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, and a lot of them are particularly restricted to Nee Soon swamp forest within the Central Catchment Nature Reserve. I know we walk past, one stream looks the same as the other, but the conditions in Nee Soon are very special. So 48% of Singapore's native freshwater fishes and 50% of our freshwater decapod crustaceans can be found inside the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, right? And in Nee Soon, there are some local endemics, meaning they are found only in Nee Soon and not found in other parts of Singapore, including plants and prawns and fishes. And of course, there are some global endemics, like this swamp forest crab I mentioned that now. In other words, found in Nee Soon, nowhere else in the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, nowhere else in the rest of the world. What else do these changes mean? It also means that there's freshwater biodiversity loss. So we've been losing species, right? In a study in 2003, they found that 40% of the freshwater fishes were extinct, locally extinct in Singapore. 30% of the crustaceans were extinct. And this was down primarily to habitat loss, 95% habitat loss since the 19th century. And it affects freshwater fishes and freshwater crustaceans really badly. We still have some natural habitat, right? But that remaining 5% of original forest cover is still at risk. Of course, by now, most of the forest loss has stopped, right? There's still, of course, some modifications and all that, but the really catastrophic loss generally has stopped. But the remaining part is still under risk from things like alien species and things like that. But is there some cause for optimism? I hope so. I'm trying to be optimistic. If you look at the urban environments and the alien species in the urban environments and versus the native species and the natural environments, right? there is a bit of a barrier here, okay? There's an environmental filtering barrier because, again, like I said, the native species don't like to go out to the urban habitats. Similarly, a lot of the urban species, the non-native species, don't particularly like to go into the natural habitats, right? That's environmental. Second thing is there's a form of biotic resistance. That means the community itself is able to withstand an invasion by a non-native. Either they will outcompete the invader, or they will be predators of the invader and things like that. Of course, there will always be one or two that slip through. So those are the ones we need to keep our eye on, right? But that is an optimistic note. So what do you do? Now, with some optimism, we move on, right? So dealing with change, because all these changes, right? These changes all sound really depressing, but try to be optimistic. All right. So how do we deal with the change? These are just some of the ways we try to deal with the change. We've been doing various things, right? Basically, I'm talking about freshwater biodiversity conservation and different ways of different manifestations of freshwater biodiversity conservation. One, which I'm more familiar with, is basically research. You have to do research, fundamental research, as well as applied biodiversity and ecological research. Now, these are just some examples of the research that has been done, and these are some of the products of the research. So we've done baseline biodiversity studies, because if you don't study, if you don't know what's there to begin with, and you don't understand their interactions with one another, how to conserve, right? Or at least how to, conserve with a more informed perspective, right? So baseline biodiversity studies, community field studies, we've been doing this in the CCNR and other streams since the 1990s, in Singapore's reservoirs since the 2000s, biomonitoring. And it's not, when I say we, I don't mean my group only, right? This is the general community here in Singapore that works on freshwater biodiversity, of colleagues at NParks, colleagues at BUB, and Nature Society, and other universities, and so on and so forth. So biomonitoring work. Biomonitoring means you use organisms to monitor the environment. Their presence and their absence can tell you something about the conditions in the environment, right? In addition to chemical testing, you can test the water and all this kind of thing. But sometimes testing the water chemically, right, can give you a very short-term idea, whereas organisms can give you a sort of a longer term perspective of what is going on there. Okay. And sometimes we've done studies on specific groups, dragonflies, alien species, or Singaporeans, Singapore freshwater crab. Another aspect of biodiversity conservation is habitat protection. So just now was research, so now it's habitat protection, restoration, rehabilitation. So NParks is really leading away with regards to restoration, because they are the stewards of a lot of our natural areas, right? The Central Catchment Nature Reserve. Besides the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, right, they also have established a lot of these nature parks along the fringes, right? So these nature parks are very important. They are buffer parks, right? Why am I talking about this? I'm still talking about freshwater, because there are streams running through these parks, okay? This whole area, there are a lot of streams all over the place, okay? So I'm not just talking about terrestrial trees and all that, right? And most of the time, if you read what NParks does, right, when they talk about the restoration plan, they talk about planting trees, planting native plants and all that. Ultimately, all that affects the watershed, right? Because everything flows into the streams in the end, right? So if you can maintain the integrity of the forest and the quality of the forest, that will have trickle-down effects, okay, onto the streams in the area. Right? Habitat restoration is one of the approaches to dealing with these changes, right? A study we did said that Singapore's buffer parks actually, besides protecting the core forest area, they actually help to maintain the freshwater communities, and it limits the impacts of urbanization in the streams. PUB is also involved in freshwater conservation, right? In the case of PUB, the Active Beautiful Clean Waters program, they do a lot of rehabilitation. Now, rehabilitation is a bit different from restoration. Restoration, you generally try to put back the same stuff that was there, or more of the same. That means the native trees, the original environment, they bring it back to its original state. Rehabilitation is, look, this place is already very different, and it's not practical to bring back the original condition. So I try to make, using different set of parameters, using different set of plants and all that, just improve the quality of this place. Still bring it back to a desirable level, but with a different set of plants and conditions. That's rehabilitation, okay? So PUB does that through their ABC Waters program in various places. And the good thing about this is the knock-on effect of this is that because now they allow people to access the water, right? Last time in the old days, the easiest way to do water security is, okay, nobody touch, everybody cannot come here, not allowed to go near the water, right? Now there's a lot more access to the water. So there's greater stewardship and ownership, right? So people will be more inclined to, okay, I want to keep the water clean because, my kid going to go there and play in the water or something like that. And I just like to see these water features and all that. So there's more stewardship and ownership being instilled. The most famous case of ABC, or one of their most famous cases, is the Kallang River at Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park, right? Which is this waterway at Bishan Park, which is a classic rehabilitation project. Why do I say rehabilitation and not restoration? In this case, rehabilitation, because our forest stream doesn't look like this, right? Our forest stream, I said, full of trees and all that, very small, very shallow and all that. It's not this big open thing. Yet this big open thing is very nice, right? And you can't remake the forest. You bring back the forest, you have to kick out everybody from Bishan and Ang Mo Kio. So, but anyway, we did some studies, then we found that, although it's dominated by non-native species, it still has a slightly higher percentage of native species, a tougher native species, than a normal canal. Because remember, this Bishan Park used to be just a normal canal, right? So a normal canal will have less natives than here. So okay, better than nothing, right? This brings me to something else. When there are introduced species in urban environments are mainly suitable for non-native species. Native species don't like them very much. As I mentioned, do we act or do we not act? Right? I get this question from certain people who will remain anonymous, right? And I get these comments like, you lose biodiversity, you complain. I give you biodiversity, you also complain, right? Because this biodiversity is non-native biodiversity. So of course the initial reaction is, native will be better, right? But in situations where you're in urban environments and the native species will not do well, you have to think about the trade-off between restoration and rehabilitation. Whether, you can't take the forest species and throw them into Bishan Park, they will die anyway. Anyway, that's some of the issues involved in that. Oh, and I put this here just to remind everyone, Kallang, the Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park, the river there is meant to flood. So, it's built to flood. So when it floods, don't panic. It's supposed to ease flooding from the rest of from the road and all that. So it's still a canal, right? It still functions as a canal. We also do species conservation planning. We do strategic planning. One example was to save the Singapore freshwater crab, which was critically endangered, or still is critically endangered, one of the world's most threatened species. And what we did was we got a whole group of stakeholders from different organizations, government, non-government, local and overseas experts. We brought them all together and we had this round table where we identified all the different threats and came up with ultimately a plan, a strategy for the species. Because it's one thing to just say, hey, we should conserve. It's a different thing to sit down and say, okay, now let's put a plan together. And then after that, it's about implementation. So these are some of the products from this conservation strategy, some research, some actual captive breeding and things like that. In terms of invasive species policy and management for freshwater conservation, there are no direct legislation in Singapore for invasive species, but there are every now and then new bills that are introduced that will help to address the problem of invasive species without naming invasive species, right? So this was a particularly useful thing where the new law was you cannot release a species. You're not supposed to release species inside the nature reserve, but now we recognize that it's all connected, right? The waterways are all connected. So if you release a non-native species or anything into a longkang outside the nature reserve, but that longkang flows into the nature reserve, you can also be in trouble, right? So you shouldn't do that. Further downstream, more into enforcement, policy and management, MPARKS. Oh, Visak Day, right? This week, try not to release things. So MPARKS and PUB and all the NGOs, they tend to focus, especially on Visak Day, but it goes on throughout the year. People release things. So to actively encourage people not to release species, aquatic as well as terrestrial. Finally, one final aspect of biodiversity conservation is through education outreach. There are a lot of books. It's not just scientific journals and technical reports. It's about producing things that are more palatable, accessible, and that basically reach out to everybody. So these are some of the things that have been done by various groups involved over the years, and more to come, I'm sure.